It's good to be with you, and encouraging to see so many faces from the past and some new ones. So yeah, let's press on. So we're continuing to look at the Joseph story. This time, Steve's asked me to look at it through the lens of growing in maturity, and especially focusing on the years of Joseph, aged between 17 and 30. And I am assuming that you're at least familiar with the story, but if you do have a Bible to hand, feel free to follow along, but it isn't essential if it's in the other end of the house. Cool. So to frame this time together, I thought we could jump to the end of this period where Joseph has just interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. So in chapter 41, verses 38 and 39, we read this. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are." So it seems like discernment and wisdom are key to growing in maturity. And then if you read on, we'll see that Pharaoh gives Joseph a new name, that name being Zephanath-Paneah. Sounds a bit like one of Steve's favorite curries. Steve's a curry man, if you don't know. And some have suggested it might mean code breaker. And as I've been reading and rereading the Joseph story, it occurs to me that it's a little bit like an escape room. So for my birthday a few weeks back, some friends bought me an online escape room that we did together. And there was a whole bunch of PDF documents to read through, and to try and work out like the clues. And also, as you're reading through, you're not really knowing what you're looking for at first. But as you go on, you kind of start to build up a picture and make connections and try and figure out the code. And I think this is a little bit like how biblical narrative works too. The more you read it, the more the clues to understanding what's going on start to pop out to you. And perhaps this is also a helpful analogy when to consider when thinking about what it's like to grow in maturity. We can't always see where we're going, and life is a roller coaster, in the words of Ronan Keating. But at key opportune times, our level of maturity and wisdom will reveal itself and be seen by others. And I think that's exactly what happens in the Joseph story. Pharaoh comments that the Spirit of God is in him, and then he goes on to say, there is none so discerning and wise. So it's quite the contrast to the Joseph that we meet at the beginning of the story, and the one that's seen through his brother's eyes. So 2 questions or ideas that will help us to try and unlock key ingredients for growing in maturity from this story. The first will be using the definition of wisdom from Proverbs, which is fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is insight. So each point in the story, we can ask ourselves, what is Joseph's view of God, or how is he fearing him? And then the second is, how does Joseph understand himself? So it's view of God and sense of self. So if you switch off at any point in the next 20 minutes and you come back around, just ask yourself those questions and read the story, and you'll be right as rain. Cool. So back in chapter 37, as Beth helpfully unpacked last time, we meet Joseph the gossip. His pastime is provoking his stepbrothers. He does this by flaunting his father's favor and then rubbing it in their faces by showing off his fancy jacket, as well as boasting about his dreams and their meaning. They hate him, plot to kill him. Thankfully, Reuben steps in, and instead, they end up stripping him of his fancy jacket and throwing him in the pit and then selling him into slavery. And at this point, you can't help but feel a little bit sorry for Joseph. He was clearly being a bit of a jerk, but did he deserve to end up being thrown in a pit and then sold into slavery? Seems a little bit harsh. One thing about this episode that really sticks out to me, though, is the lack of mention of God in the whole chapter. And focusing on Joseph, he doesn't seem to have him in mind. Or perhaps his view of God and his faith is really just that of his father's, Jacob. Imagine for a moment his journey to Egypt. What would be going through his mind? Surely this has to be the worst moment of his life, and he has nowhere to turn except God. So when I was a similar age, I remember well being thrown into my own pit of despair. You guessed it, teenage Adam got dumped by a girl. So, I mean, it amuses me now, but at the time it had to be probably the worst moment of my life. However, without it, my fear and view of God wouldn't have shifted so significantly for the better. And looking back, I'm so grateful it happened and that it happened at that point in my life. So growing in maturity and wisdom is dependent on a healthy fear and trust in God. So if we're to be growing in maturity, then our trust in God should be growing. But also our view of God needs to be growing. Because if your view of God isn't continuing to grow and develop, then in a crisis moment, your view of God will collapse, and along with it, your fear of God. Now, what do I mean by view of God? It's our understanding of who God is. If you think about explaining God to a young child, naturally, you're going to simplify the way that you describe and talk about him. So conversely, our view of God needs to grow and develop from a simplistic one to one that's something greater, one that embraces mystery and doesn't place limits on him. Okay, so moving on to the next episode, chapter 39, we see the Lord appears on the scene. And I think at this point, it's safe to say, being thrown in a pit and then sold into slavery has put the fear of God into Joseph. And so he gets his head down, and verse 2 tells us he became a successful man. And the Lord blesses him and all that he does, and he ends up in charge of Potiphar's household. So let's pick up the story in the second half of verse 6, chapter 39. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me, except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her or be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. As soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice. As soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until her master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." Okay, so here we see Joseph faces his first test of his newfound fear of God in the form of his tempting master's wife. And it's one that turns out to be a continual test until the whole thing just blows up. Now, it's interesting that in the previous tension between Joseph and his brothers, Joseph was the one pushing the button of his brothers and provoking them. This time it's flipped, and it's Potiphar's wife who is the provocateur. It's Joseph's button that is being pushed, and she ain't beating around the bush. Bed, now! Her blunt demand is met by Joseph's lengthy reply, and this is the first time that a character in the story mentions God, when he says, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now, that obviously doesn't dissuade Potiphar's wife, and it all comes to a head when she sees that opportunity one day. With no one around, she grabs him by the garment, demands again, "Bed, now!" Joseph is left with no alternative but to flee naked. So by doing the right thing, he actually compromises himself and leaves himself open for Potiphar's wife to use his garment as evidence against him. So do you see the parallels, or remember the parallels? Both bust-ups involve Joseph, an item of his wardrobe, and the other party using it as evidence against him to tell their twisted truths. So the first time, Joseph flaunts his fancy jacket and pays the price, ending up in a pit, highlighting his immaturity, even if he didn't deserve such rough treatment. The second time, Joseph flees from his garment, again pays the price and ends up in a pit, but this time highlighting a significant growth in his maturity, especially as he didn't deserve such treatment to end up in prison. Okay, but we read on and we see that the Lord was still with Joseph. Not only that, but he showed him steadfast love and gave favor to him in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So let's just consider for a moment what might have been going on in Joseph's head at this point. So he's realized that flaunting his father's favor over his brothers was not only foolish, but wrong. So it figures, do bad stuff and bad stuff will happen to you, right? But then in Egypt, we meet a reformed Joseph who develops into a successful man, becoming reliable, God-fearing, seems like he's growing in maturity. So the flip side is, it follows, do good stuff and good stuff happens to you, right? However, this time he does the right or the good thing and something bad happens. So that first night in prison, surely he has to be thinking, why or how did God let this happen? And it's here that he's confronted with his view of God. Does God only bless the righteous and punish the wicked? If that's the case, how does he make sense of what just happened? Either he has to develop a more nuanced view of God, or it will collapse along with his fear of God. Now, clearly we know it's the former, and it's God's reassuring, steadfast love and favor that allow him to enlarge his view of God and deepen his trust in him. Okay, so let's move on to the next episode. And this is where we meet Pharaoh's cupbearer and bread baker. And I've always wondered where the candlestick maker is, but alas, he's been left out of this story. So they enter the scene, and it's dream time again. And it seems like it's one of those moments where Joseph is in the right place at the right time. Of course, it's God who puts Joseph in a particular place at a particular time, that he might play a significant role, and not only in his own future, but in the future of his family, and ultimately God's overarching plan for humanity. And it's here I also think we see another sign of Joseph's budding maturity. So it's one thing to be in the right place at the right time, but it's another to realize and seize the opportunity. And he seizes the opportunity because he has a growing clarity of his identity, gifting, and abilities. And again, these things are rooted in his fear of God. So when he finds out that the cupbearer and the bread baker have both dreamed, but no one can interpret them, he knows God has blessed him with the gift of interpreting dreams. And he acknowledges they belong to God. So in chapter 40, verse 8, Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So do you see? It's his growing fear of God and his developing view of who he is, along with his sharpened sense of self, that allows him to seize the opportunity and participate in fulfilling God's will. So moving to Latvia and being here, in many ways I can relate to Joseph. Thankfully, I didn't need to get beaten up, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery, but our ending up in Latvia was a result of God doing the provoking. But when we got here, actually we found ourselves in an unexpected and uncomfortable situation. Certainly wasn't one that we had planned or anticipated, but it did mean that we ended up trying a lot of different things, trying to say yes more often than no. Some of those things went well, some of them not so well. And I think it's quite normal to be trying different things in your 20s and 30s as you explore yourself and what you're good at. But I think the key to maturity is learning from those experiences and sharpening your understanding of yourself. So for me, in the last couple of years, some things have really come into focus. And now I feel like when different opportunities come along, I'm much better equipped to know which ones to say yes to and to seize, like Joseph, and when to say no, because I have a much better idea of what is a good fit for me. So I'll give you a quick example. If you remember, like a year ago when the pandemic first hit back in March, things were going pretty well. The first half of the academic year, I'd started a discussion group with a couple of guys, and with the aim of creating a kind of neutral, safe space to discuss life and faith and to deepen relationships. And the first semester went really well. And slowly, here and there, one or two more joined. And just before the start of the second semester, a friend who'd been out of Latvia for a few months came back. We connected on a deeper level, and he joined. And we started dreaming and scheming, and things just seemed to kind of move up a gear. Then just when I'm feeling kind of super excited, hopeful about the group and everything gets shut down. It took me a good week or two to stop sulking, get a grip on my doom scrolling, and then to realize and seize the opportunity. And I can only describe it as being in the right place at the right time. My creative juices and ideas were flowing. I was working with someone who enabled me and affirmed me. I was able to use my gifting and personality and just be me. And even though we couldn't meet in person as a group, we doubled in number. We moved from intellectual conversations to heart conversations. We sparked generosity by doing a bunch of fun things, created bonds with each other that we'll never forget. And we even dubbed ourselves Corona Crew. But yeah, this is a group that more than half were not Christian. Yet what was happening there can only be described as God's blessing and favor. And I think that's what it looks like to be in the right place at the right time, to have a healthy fear of God, a developing view of who he is, as well as a sharpened sense of self. So as you grow in maturity, you learn to seize the opportunities that are a good fit, whatever the circumstances. Now, of course, the outcome of the opportunity is another matter. And back to the Joseph story, Joseph is made to wait and be patient. Sounds like another important ingredient to growing maturity. 2 years later, finally the stage is set. At just the right time, the cupbearer recovers from his amnesia and remembers there was a Hebrew lad who he'd witnessed interpret dreams, Joseph. Time to shine, Joe. So chapter 41, picking up from verse 14. The Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he'd shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Okay, so Joseph's big break, and his first words to Pharaoh are, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Step 1 to growing in maturity, fearing God, check. Okay, let's pick it up from verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. So he's giving his interpretation. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after the 7 years, and the 7 empty blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Okay, so far he's acknowledged God. He's used his gifting to explain Pharaoh's dream. And now he's going to go one step further. And he sticks his neck out and he offers a full-blown proposal. Now you have to wonder, is this arrogant Joseph showing off again? Or is this the matured and bold Joseph who knows when to speak up and when to hold his tongue? So let's read on. Verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. So this time, Joseph not only seizes the opportunity, he then proceeds to smash it out of the park. He boldly and confidently puts forward his proposal, which involves a job description that only he can fulfill. That's pretty ballsy. And he manages to present it with tactfulness, diplomacy, and humility. He could have just said, Pharaoh, it's fine, put me in charge, I'll see to it that it goes well. But he doesn't. He's grown and matured. And I think this is the model of maturity from the life of Joseph that we have. So just to round up, we read on in verse 40. Pharaoh says to Joseph, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. So, did you see how this part of the story ends? Again, we see Joseph and his newest item from his wardrobe. But this time, Joseph isn't flaunting or fleeing from his garments. No, and they're not even being used against him to twist the truth. No, this time, Pharaoh clothes him in garments of fine linen, which represent Joseph's fulfillment of his dreams and his progressive transformation from immature and impetuous teenager to the most discerning and wise man in the whole of Egypt. So to summarize, I think if we're growing in maturity by seeking an ever increasing view of God, and if we're working on a sharpened sense of self, when the opportunity comes along, we will be ready to seize it with both hands. And who knows how and where God will use us in the future. So thanks for listening. I hope that was good. So Steve, do you want me to mention the questions or?
Yes, if you want to just say a few bits about the questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I just got kind of 3 questions or 3 sections, I guess, for you to think about. The first, I think Steve's going to put it up on a slide. But the first is, what have you noticed in the Joseph story or from what I've shared that is helpful in thinking about growing in maturity? And then the second, how has your view of God developed over the years? And how have key moments in your life, whether they're good, difficult, or stretching, helped or hindered in that process? And then finally, how are you trying to sharpen your sense of yourself? And yeah, share what's helped, because I think that could be a really, really valuable and fruitful thing to share with each other. But yeah, thanks for listening.